still beat Trump?
You're probably waiting for the answer, weren't you? Well, we heard it ourselves with our super audio imposer that said, yes, I still think I can beat Trump. He didn't say that exactly in those words, but yes, he's still confident that he can beat Donald Trump. The President of the United States is making his 5th trip to that battleground state of Wisconsin. At least there, the polls are tighter than they are in other battleground states. We'll see how it all sorts out. Dennis Kucinich with us right now, the former mayor of Cleveland, the former Ohio congressman, and now running for Congress again, this time as an independent. Dennis, always a delight to see you. What do you think of this whole predicament with Joe Biden and other Democrats now saying, you know, maybe it's time to hang it up? Donors are abandoning him, some big ones. Are you concerned? What do you think?
Well, first of all, it's great to see you, Neil.
Same here.
President Biden is going to be pushed out. What would happen if he was? There'd be a fight over the presidential nomination, vice presidential nomination. That is what would tear the party apart. And the party was torn in 1968, but that was because of Vietnam. And the President Johnson at that time was looking at primary opponents.
Right.
Got to remember, in 2024, the DNC rigged the primaries. There's no opposition over war spending. You know, the election's not over, Neil.
So here you are. Maybe you're adding to this mix by running as an independent to take back a congressional seat. So there are those who are going to say you're hurting Democrats doing that, your old party.
Well, you know, first of all, you know, my candidacy as an independent, I'm running in a Republican district. And I've always been able to be very successful with Republican voters. And the message now is it's about the economy. And the people know me in this district. They know me very well. I'm someone who's served people, and I've done it without fear or favor.
Right. So
I'm confident going in. But as far as the larger election picture in Ohio, I think it's fair to say that President Trump has a substantial lead in Ohio.
Are you supporting Donald
Democratic
Trump?
Candidates. It's about the economy.
Are you supporting Donald Trump over Joe Biden?
No, you know, I'm a real independent. I'm not involved in a presidential race at all.
Well, you were involved in Robert Kennedy's campaign, and you left that, you quit that, or I don't want to get into the weeds here, but you know, he thinks he has a good shot at upending these guys. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure how many ballots he's going to be on. I mean, when I left the campaign last October, I began to focus on what I might be able to do to be of service.
I see.
So I'm not sure where Bobby Kennedy's campaign is going.
Allow me then, Dennis, I did ask Robert Kennedy that very question, talked to him just a couple of days ago. This is what he said on that subject. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I'll be on all 50 states within 3 weeks.
Really?
So, and the reason I'm already on more than half the states, let me put it this way so you understand. I have enough signatures to get on the ballot in more than half the states. I just have to hand them in. But the states won't accept them. They won't allow me on the ballot till the end of August because of the way their process works. So it would look to you that I'm only on the ballot in 9 states. But actually, we've done 99% of the work right now.
So bottom line, Robert, just to understand this, I'm sorry to jump on you. You're saying you will be on all 50 state ballots by Election Day.
Oh, yeah, by August. We'll be on 4 weeks from now, we'll be on the ballot in every state.
See, Dennis, I don't just rudely interrupt great people like you. I rudely interrupted him. But the gist of that was he thinks he'll be on all 50 state ballots. Now, that might be a leap. But what do you think the impact would be if he were?
Well, first of all, he certainly knows a lot more about his campaign than I do because I left in October. Now, if he was on the ballot in all 50 states, if there's any states which are toss-ups, he could play an impact. But, you know, at this point, it's speculative because we don't know that he is on the ballot everywhere. And he's my friend. I wish him well, but I'm not involved in the presidential election on anyone's behalf. I'm running in Ohio, and I'm focused on the needs of the people in a congressional district. Many of those people I've served over the years.
You know, I think you're 77 years young. You're quick and fast on your feet. I would not know that you're that old. That's not old, by the way. That, to me, is young these days. But yet, you can have a situation like what Joe Biden's going through. He's just a few years older than you, but he's in a world of hurt. And a lot of people say cognitively, he's just not up to that job. Do you think that's the case? And do you think further that we should start having these sort of demands that doctors examine presidents of that age, or those who want to be president or close to that age, more aggressively than they do younger?
Well, first of all, the American people are going to be the judge of the fitness of someone for the office of presidency. You know, and if someone can't serve, the 25th Amendment is the prescription for being able to move forward and make another choice. You've got two factors here, Neil. One is the nomination, the Democratic Party. I'm saying right now, I doubt very seriously that President Biden would be replaced, and I think the party would fall apart if there was a contest for the nomination. The second thing is the fitness of someone for the presidency. The 25th Amendment is very clear on this. If a president is unable to go forward, then the cabinet has to get together and they make some decisions. I don't see that happening either. I think that President Biden is in this election to stay, based on all the things that I know about politics. And as far as his fitness for office, the American people are going to be the ultimate judge. And frankly, I'm okay with that. I'll tell you why. Because I have a concern about a kind of bum's rush that's being given to try to by the media savants to try to push a president out. It's not too dissimilar from what happened when they tried to push President Trump out. I mean, this is the kind of, you know, these elites on both sides. We got to be careful about yielding to that. Let the American people make the choice.
Unless you're doing something really bad in office in real time, right?
I'm sorry, Neil?
Unless you're doing something really bad in real time in office at that time, right?
Well, look, if someone is not able to continue the functions of the office, they can be replaced. But if something, wait a minute, if somebody's doing something real bad, that's you know, a political judgment. Look, we could have a major war between now and the election. That could change everything. The pot's boiling right now in the Middle East and in Europe and in the Far East with China over Taiwan. So this ball is still in play. This election, you know, people would say, well, it's over. Donald Trump's the president. President Trump knows better than anybody that you can go right down to the line and an election could change like that. Hillary Clinton knows that, too.
Very good point on all. Dennis, great catching up with you. Dennis Kucinich, we're following his independent race to return to Congress. Very close.